right, so let's take a look at the American anti-communist crusade. And the first place I want us to start is with a short video which talks about a predominant theme within the American anti-communist crusade. It's something that we'll come back to a little bit more, but it also gives a nice introduction to this. So without further ado.
Imagine that one day you're summoned before a government panel. Even though you haven't committed any crime or been formally charged with one, you are repeatedly questioned about your political views, accused of disloyalty, and asked to incriminate your friends and associates. If you don't cooperate, you risk jail or losing your job. This is exactly what happened in the United States in the 1950s as part of a campaign to expose suspected communists. Named after its most notorious practitioner, the phenomenon known as McCarthyism destroyed thousands of lives and careers. For over a decade, American political leaders trampled democratic freedoms in the name of protecting them. During the 1930s and 1940s, there had been an active but small communist party in the United States. Its record was mixed. While it played crucial roles in wider progressive struggles for labor and civil rights, it also supported the Soviet Union. From the start, the American Communist Party faced attacks from conservatives and business leaders, as well as from liberals who criticized its ties to the oppressive Soviet regime. During World War II, when the USA and USSR were allied against Hitler, some American communists actually spied for the Russians. When the Cold War escalated and this espionage became known, domestic communism came to be seen as a threat to national security. But the attempt to eliminate that threat soon turned into the longest-lasting and most widespread episode of political repression in American history. Spurred on by a network of bureaucrats, politicians, journalists, and businessmen, the campaign wildly exaggerated the danger of communist subversion. The people behind it harassed anyone suspected of holding left-of-center political views or associating with those who did. If you hung modern art on your walls, had a multiracial social circle, or signed petitions against nuclear weapons, you might just have been a communist. Starting in the late 1940s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the resources of his agency to hunt down such supposed communists and eliminate them from any position of influence within American society. And the narrow criteria that Hoover and his allies used to screen federal employees spread to the rest of the country. Soon, Hollywood studios, universities, car manufacturers, and thousands of other public and private employers were imposing the same political tests on the men and women who worked for them. Meanwhile, Congress conducted its own witch hunt, subpoenaing hundreds of people to testify before investigative bodies like the House Un-American Activities Committee. If they refused to cooperate, they could be jailed for contempt, or, more commonly, fired and blacklisted. Ambitious politicians like Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy used such hearings as a partisan weapon, accusing Democrats of being soft on communism and deliberately losing China to the communist bloc. McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, became notorious by flaunting ever-changing lists of alleged communists within the State Department. Egged on by other politicians, he continued to make outrageous accusations while distorting or fabricating evidence. Many citizens reviled McCarthy, while others praised him. And when the Korean War broke out, McCarthy seemed vindicated. Once he became chair of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in 1953, McCarthy's recklessness increased. It was his investigation of the Army that finally turned public opinion against him and diminished his power. McCarthy's colleagues in the Senate censured him, and he died less than 3 years later, probably from alcoholism. McCarthyism ended as well. It had ruined hundreds, if not thousands, of lives and drastically narrowed the American political spectrum. Its damage to democratic institutions would be long-lasting. In all likelihood, there were both Democrats and Republicans who knew that the anti-communist purges were deeply unjust, but feared that directly opposing them would hurt their careers. Even the Supreme Court failed to stop the witch hunt, condoning serious violations of constitutional rights in the name of national security. Was domestic communism an actual threat to the American government? Perhaps, though a small one. But the reaction to it was so extreme that it caused far more damage than the threat itself. And if new demagogues appeared in uncertain times to attack unpopular minorities in the name of patriotism, could it all happen again?
All right, so that kind of gives us a bit of an introduction to America's anti-communist crusade. It had a wide-ranging impact on American life. We see, as part of our Cold War efforts, the creation and installment of a permanent military-industrial establishment. Unlike after the First World War, there would be no return to normalcy. Spending helped to fuel economic growth and support not only improved weaponry, but also aircraft, computers, medicine, and other products that had an impact on civilian life. Federal projects would also play a big role: weapons development, the building of military bases, higher education, the interstate highway system. All of these things would come out of the anti-communist crusade. We'll also, of course, see some more negative consequences. The culture of secrecy and dishonesty will descend upon the United States, with people being encouraged to spy on their neighbors and tell on them if they are practicing subversive activities, like hanging modern art on your walls and stuff like that. We'll also get some revision of the immigration policy. We'll be very happy to accept refugees from communist countries, regardless of national origin quotas at this point, although that won't extend to immigrants from everywhere. Segregation will also start to see a little bit of breakage as a result of our international embarrassment at just how we weren't doing freedom very well, supposedly the leaders of the free world. However, we'll also see some assault on the right to dissent. People will be encouraged to draw a sharp line between patriotism and disloyalty. This will result in an attack on the very thing we claim to stand for, which is freedom. The freedom to disagree with what's going on around you, with the decisions of your government. Disagreement was seen as a bad thing. With the anti-communist crusade, we'll get an early iteration of it in Truman's loyalty review system, put in place in 1947. It is in response to charges that he was being soft on communism. Truman will introduce a loyalty review system for federal employees, where they had to demonstrate their patriotism without any chance to face their accusers or sometimes even know what they are being accused of. The loyalty review system failed to uncover any spies, but they did dismiss several hundred people from their jobs, ultimately for no reason. This would get a more official connotation and a more national connotation in the creation of the House Un-American Activities Committee. The committee is particularly interested on hearing about what Hollywood is doing. The movie industry has a particular ability to transmit ideas, public opinion, and there is a fear that they could transmit subversive messages as well. To that end, a lot of Hollywood stars, executives, producers, directors, everyone are called in to testify before this committee and essentially justify or prove their patriotism before Congress. Some cooperated. Some celebrities like Walt Disney, Gary Cooper, and a young actor by the name of Ronald Reagan testified that the movie industry was harboring numerous communists. However, others were more resistant. The infamous Hollywood 10, people who were people who were called to testify and refused to answer questions about their politics or to name names, argued that the hearing violated their First Amendment guarantees of speech and association. The committee ultimately charged them with contempt of Congress, and they were jailed for 6 months. Hollywood studios also introduced blacklists. Anyone who refused to cooperate with the committee were blacklisted, and so they were given no more work in Hollywood, ultimately silencing many promising young creators in the movie industry. We're also going to see a successful, I'll put that in quotation, spy trial. The trial and conviction and imprisonment of a number of individuals, including Alger Hiss, who was accused of giving secret State Department documents to the Soviets back in the 30s. He vehemently denied the charge, but he was still sentenced to 5 years in prison. We'll also see trials and convictions and imprisonment for Communist Party leaders, but probably most famously, the trial, conviction, and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, to which I have another short video.
Morton Sobel, the principal in America's first atomic spy trial, leaves New York's federal court. An electronics expert, he's accused with Julius Rosenberg, electrical engineer, of conspiring to give Russia vital secrets of the atom bomb. Rosenberg's wife is also accused of complicity in the plot against the country's security.
In 1950, America's post-war Red Scare began, triggered by Senator Joseph McCarthy's claim that American citizens were working as spies for the USSR. He might have been describing Julius Rosenberg.
So the Rosenbergs were a couple who met in New York. They were both children of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and they were members of the Communist Party. They were both communists in the sense that they belonged to radical organizations that had affiliated with the Communist Party. They were involved in unions, and they met each other through their radicalism.
Rosenberg was an engineer with the U.S. Army Signal Corps and a member of a spy ring that included Morton Sobel and Ethel Rosenberg's brother, David Greenglass. After the conspiracy was uncovered in 1950, the Rosenbergs became the only members not to make a deal with the prosecutors.
Julius Rosenberg will not give names. He maintains his innocence all along, and that of Ethel. Neither one of them will give names. The two have children. They have 2 sons. They wind up in Sing Sing prison.
The Rosenbergs were convicted on March 29, 1951, and sentenced to death, a sentence carried out on June 19, 1953.
The electric chair awaited the 2 convicted spies as the hour of their final reckoning approached, and then it was over. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had paid their debt to society with their lives. For the first time in its 177-year history, a United States civil court had decreed and followed through on the execution of 2 native-born Americans on the charge of espionage.
The Rosenberg sons spent decades trying to clear their parents' names. But declassified information has since confirmed that Julius Rosenberg was indeed guilty of passing on American secrets.
But it's pretty clear that he was probably a small fry spy in terms of the quality of the information he was giving. There were other spies who were passing along better information from the Manhattan Project. However, that information that all of them gave was important to the creation of a bomb by the Soviets. I think Ethel and Julius represent different legacies. I just don't think there was any reason at all to prosecute Ethel other than to go after Julius. That was craven. They did it because they could, because it made the national security state look strong, like they were doing something that had to be done. It's a complex legacy.
All right, so looking at the general view of McCarthyism and this anti-communist sort of vendetta by the U.S. government, Joseph McCarthy was practically a nobody in the Senate. He was very little known, senator from Wisconsin. He had his sort of emergence as the anti-communist kind of guru in a speech that he gave in Wheeling, West Virginia, to a women's organization there, where he announced that he had a laundry list of 205 communists working in the State Department. He never identified any names and initially was ignored, but as he gained traction, McCarthy began to shoot a little bit too high. As they mentioned in the first video, McCarthy's downfall came with the Army hearings. His attempts to investigate charges that the Army had harbored and coddled communists were his undoing. And at least part of that had to do with the television. These hearings were televised, and these revealed him to the public to be a bully who would browbeat witnesses and make sweeping accusations with no basis in fact. He also was repeatedly sort of scolded by Joseph Welch, who was the chief lawyer for the Army. And eventually this kind of broke the spell. The Senate passed a censure on McCarthy and he was kind of shut down. However, despite shutting him down, McCarthyism entered the vocabulary as a shorthand for character assassination or the abuse of power in the name of anti-communism. And it went far beyond just the Senate or the House Un-American Activities Committee. We see these actions carried out into society itself. And in our next lecture, that's what we'll look at.